Hello, and welcome everyone to this exciting episode of Imugene's Azer-cel Science Series. I'm Leslie Chong. I'm the CEO and Managing Director at Imugene, and I'm honored to be with your host today. We're so glad you could join us to dive into some of the groundbreaking work happening at Imugene in the world of immunotherapy, focusing on our recent progress and data in Azer-cel, our allogeneic CAR-T cell therapy platform in blood cancers. I am so happy to be joined by two exceptional leaders in the field of hematology oncology, drug development, our Chief Medical Officer, Dr. John Byon, and Dr. Joseph Maakaron is one of the principal investigators on the Azer-cel clinical trial currently at Northside. Thank you for joining Dr. Byon and Dr. Maakaron.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for inviting us.
Great. So I'm going to start with John. John, just to set the scene for the audience, can you briefly explain what Imugene's Azer-cel is and what patient population we are currently treating?
Sure. So Azer-cel, as you've mentioned, is an allogeneic CAR T cell therapy. So this means we collect healthy T cells from normal donors. They get engineered at the manufacturing facility to express a certain protein called the chimeric antigen receptor, or the CAR, that helps it target the CD19 protein that's present on the tumor cells. And once we give it back to the patient, then the T cell is able to specifically target and kill only the tumor cells in the patient's body. And we are currently investigating Azer-cel in types of aggressive B-cell lymphomas. So these are cancers of the lymph nodes primarily. They can spread to other places, but that's the most common location for these types of cancers.
Great. So again, for those less familiar with this particular space of CAR-T, can you break down the difference between autologous and allogeneic CAR-T therapies?
Yeah, absolutely. Autologous just means the T cells come from the patient's own body. So that means, once a patient becomes a candidate for autologous CAR T cell therapy, they need to get their T cells collected from their blood. Then it goes through the same manufacturing process. And then once it's done and it then gets shipped back to the clinical site where then it can be infused back to the patient. So, this whole process of collection, manufacturing, shipping back and forth can take anywhere from, 4 to 8 weeks. Allogeneic again means that we take the cells from a healthy person. So all of the manufacturing is done in advance. So when a patient, shows up, for example, at Dr. Maakaron's office, and they're a candidate and they decide to move forward, with Azer-cel, all they have to do is, inform us, and then we ship the cells to their site, and they can infuse the cell product just within a few days.
Wow. What are some of the key limitations of autologous CAR T therapy, other than what you've mentioned so far, the 4 to 8 weeks wait? And how does an allogeneic approach like Azer-cel help address those challenges?
Right. So obviously access is the biggest one. So, ideally, I'm sure most patients and physicians wouldn't want to wait that time because who knows what's going to happen to their cancer. It could start to spread, the patient could get worse, or, some other um, medical problem could arise to delay them getting their autologous CAR T cell product. The other thing is for autologous cell therapies, they're primarily given at very specialized centers. And there are more patients than there really are these centers. So especially in such a big country like the United States, where if a patient lives in a more remote area, they may have to drive several hours or even get on a plane to get to one of these specialized CAR T cell centers. For allogeneic therapy, again, there is no or a very minimal waiting period. Once a patient is found to be eligible, cells can be shipped and be there for the patient within a few days. The other thing is because of that, the hope is then that will allow more patients access. So they don't necessarily have to be at these specialized CAR T cell centers. Um, but that, they could get it closer to home. Like maybe, if someone is in a very remote population place, it may not be at their local doctor's office, but, you know, if they need to drive, say, 2 hours to the next biggest town or city, that they could, potentially get it there.
A true on-demand therapy. Azercel includes interleukin 2 in our regimen. Can you explain why that's been added and what role does it play in the therapy? Also, from a safety standpoint, how is that manageable?
Yeah, I mean, IL-2 is a, naturally produced protein. In fact, the immune cells, especially T cells, are the cell type that produces most of the IL-2 in our bodies. And T cells will make IL-2 in response to fighting off infections or actually even, trying to eliminate early cancers in our body. And so we added it in order to, we hoped what it would essentially do is sort of jumpstart Azer-cel. So um, to allow it to sort of get a boost once it's there and allow it to kind of really start to, the cells to divide and be more active earlier. We think that, that was the theory behind it. And then thankfully, that's sort of what's played out in the clinic. In terms of the side effects, so, IL-2 is used, very rarely, but it's used in other types of cancers, particularly in melanoma and kidney cancer. However, in those cancers, it's given at very, very high doses, basically, hundreds of times more than what we give. And that can have significant side effects. However, we give a very low dose under the skin, and the direct side effects from IL-2, I would say, are pretty minimal. Patients sometimes get a reaction at the injection site. They can have, some redness, a little bit of discomfort, some swelling, maybe a fever that, that goes away pretty quickly. But really, it is very minimal in terms of side effects directly from IL-2.
And looking at the latest clinical data, are patients responding to Azer-cel? And importantly, what are you seeing in terms of durability of those responses?
Yeah, absolutely. Patients are responding as in our most recent press release. Out of the 12 patients, 9 of the 12 or 75% have had a response. And these are patients who have had multiple lines of therapy, and every single one of those patients has had a prior autologous CAR T cell product and then relapsed or failed. And that's pretty remarkable. I mean, that response rate, although it's still early days and small patient number, that response rate is very similar to what you would expect from autologous CAR T cell therapy. And now we're seeing that, at least one line of therapy later, which I think is fantastic. In terms of the durability, we definitely have some patients who have very durable responses. Again, the this part of the study is still very early and enrollment is really picking up. We have one patient who is now been in a complete remission, meaning no evidence of disease, for a little over 15 months, and a second patient is approaching their 1 year mark. So, we are very hopeful. Obviously, we need to follow these patients longer and treat more patients, but we do think that based on this early data, that Azer-cel is showing a lot of promise.
That's great. Joseph, as an oncologist and investigator with direct experience treating patients with Azer-cel, can you share your perspective on the patient's experience and outcomes you've observed so far?
Absolutely. So, before I start, let me just say that, obviously John and I, we're looking at two different sides of the same thing. And so, for me not to sort of, parrot what he said, let me just add some context. So I've been, treating patients with lymphoma for, a little bit for 9 years, 10 years, I'm going in my 10th year. And when I first started, autologous CAR Ts were not available. So they were being tested in clinical trials. And allogeneic CAR-Ts, I think maybe were still just things that you might see in science fiction books. So people were not talking about this. And back then, the patients that we used to see with these aggressive lymphomas, um, so essentially all of our available tools were chemotherapy. And then we would see patients who would just go through, this combination of chemotherapy, and then you switch around a couple of different medications and that combination of chemotherapy. And, they would just go from one chemo to another. And a lot of times, unfortunately, they, didn't make it out of, sort of the sequence of chemotherapies. So when CAR-Ts came, we were very excited, and people, went through these treatments, which at some points, they did have significant side effects, but they did a whole lot better, orders of magnitude better, and they were potentially cured. And so with the allogeneic CAR-Ts, we're even more excited because, we can take out that waiting period, and, we can potentially improve this product, we can have it ready to go. So the patients that are enrolled on the trial right now are patients with aggressive lymphoma for whom autologous CAR-T did not work. So again, we're back in the situation where, the options are limited. And I most of the patients that I enrolled on the clinical trial have actually benefited from the clinical trial, and they have achieved remissions, from Azer-cel and the interleukin 2. So my experience has been positive. If you you know um I mean, I can definitely remember all the patients' stories, when they come in, they're not feeling well. Obviously they all have, some sort of goal in mind. They want to, most of the times there's some significant event in their life when they're looking at, hey doc, I want to be around for, a few months, to this graduation or that graduation. And I think that, Azercel has, given most of them that opportunity. So I would say that it's been, pretty magical.
Oh, that's amazing. I love hearing about patients' journeys and stories. So, from your point of view, what are the key benefits of an allogeneic CAR T product like Azer-cel for both patients and treating sites?
So, from a patient point of view, um, and also from a maybe treatment side point of view, I think, eliminating the waiting period, so that apheresis period is, really significant. And when we're talking about, sort of a cancer, a lymphoma that has already progressed after autologous CAR-T, we're talking about, the worst of the worst. And so a lot of times, maybe we have something to be able to hold the patient for 3, 4 weeks, but a lot of times we do not. So having, that vial right in our pharmacy or cell therapy lab or in our facility, and, ready to go, I think is incredibly valuable, where, weeks could mean the difference between, life or death, or doing well and not doing well. From a facility point of view, I also think that, it removes all that unpredictability. So for example, these cells have already been selected, manufactured, tested, they pass, quality assurance measures, and they're ready to go, versus, the autologous CAR-Ts, they are not the same product. So they do depend on the recipient who is, giving us their lymphocytes. And I think, there's been several publications where it has been shown that they are highly variable, and they depend on, a lot of different factors that, it could be sort of treatments that the recipient has gone through, or maybe the quality of their immune system. And some of them are, things that we can measure. Some of them are things that we cannot measure. So definitely, the consistency and the availability that Azercel offers is quite beneficial and welcome.
That's great. So, you shared with us a few stories regarding your patients, but are there any patient stories or treatment experiences you can share that illustrate the impact of Azer-cel?
Um, it's always it's most impactful when it affects somebody, let's say visibly. That would be one story where people can kind of, easily relate to some of these things. And, lymphoma involves the lymph nodes, and a lot of times lymph nodes can be inside our body, but sometimes they could be, on the surface of our body. In the neck region, for example, The lymph nodes can be quite dramatic and visible, and they are they people can tell that they're sick, and people they know and don't know can also tell they're sick. So there was, we did have a woman who went through the clinical trial. She was a very nice lady, and again, she had some lymph nodes in the neck area, and she did benefit from the clinical trial. And so, you can visibly see kind of the tumors shrink through the days of her treatment. And, that was very encouraging both for her and for us and for, everybody participating in her care, kind of knowing that, oh, hey, we're doing a good thing here. This is working. So I think, that's, one story that is gonna stay with me for a long time.
So, what's your impression of the most recent Azer-cel data? How do you see it changing or improving care for patients?
So, the most recent data shows that, the vast majority of the patients, so it was, approximately three-quarters of the patients who received Azer-cel benefited from Azer-cel. And, that number, again, in the context of, these folks have been through an autologous CAR-T is, really quite encouraging and quite promising. So those would be the adjectives that I would use. Again, knowing what are the other available options. I mean, this is really quite impressive.
So, looking ahead, how do you view the opportunity to treat CAR-T naive patients with Azer-cel? What are the clinical considerations or advantages of enrolling these kind of patients?
So with the CAR-T naive population, so first of all, I mean, I think, Azercel is, going for patient, I think the rationale would be that, these patients might benefit more. Now, obviously, this is, a clinical trial question that, you guys are trying to answer. But people who have not been through autologous CAR-T may have, cancer that is slightly more easily treatable. So that, that would be in terms of, what are we expecting? We're expecting even better results. In terms of, the patient population, it definitely makes things easier. Again, I do think that waiting period is in fact detrimental to a lot of people. We when we run these clinical trials, you can very easily see on the flow chart of a clinical trial, 100 patients sign up, but only 90 or 85 or 80 actually get the CAR-Ts, and that's because they get sick while they're waiting for that CAR-T. So having that sort of product and having that vial already, at our facility or available for us would be a huge advantage to that. And again, I think the consistency is really key. Um, you know, and we've been doing, autologous CAR-T for several years now, but it's still unpredictable. We still tell people, we don't know who's going to do well and who's not. We don't know who's going to get a side effect and who's not going to get a side effect. And it is, a factor of a lot of things, the cancer and, the patient or the recipient themselves. But so having, this sort of predictable product where we say, you're going to get this dose, and we know for a fact that, it works for this amount, and, kind of some of these variables already figured out and pre-tested. I do think that's a huge advantage in terms of, how we practice.
Excellent. John, what does the competitive landscape for Azer-cel look like?
Yeah, so there are a lot of new therapies, which is great for patients. It makes our work a little bit harder, but I think at the end of the day, right, we're all collectively working to better treatments for patients. And so there are newer versions of the autologous CAR T cells where they try to target two antigens on the tumor cell surface, with the idea that that may allow the CAR T cells to work better. There are other, allogeneic CAR T cell products, similar to Azer-cel that are being investigated by other companies. And then there are, bispecific antibodies. So these are antibodies that will bind to the tumor cell on one side, and the other side, it will bind and activate T cells within the patient's body. And especially the bispecific antibodies, they are given currently mostly as a single agent by itself, but there's a lot of clinical studies where they're looking to combine those with other like chemotherapy or other agents that may improve their ability to give deep and durable responses. So and there is a lot of activity in the space. However, I think our data, although still early, looks absolutely competitive. And, if this holds true after treating more patients, I think it'll become clear, kind of um, what, uh, you know, who the leader will eventually become, right? Because it's all about that long-term data.
Data is certainly king. Well, thank you, John and Joseph, for sharing those insights. To summarize, Azer-cel is an allogeneic or off-the-shelf or on-demand CAR-T therapy currently being developed for patients with relapsed or refractory DLBCL, diffuse large B-cell lymphoma, including auto CAR-T failures. We are going into a CAR-T naive space that the team and I are quite excited about. So unlike autologous CAR-T, which requires harvesting and manufacturing each patient's cells, Azer-cel offers a faster and accessible treatment options without the same logistical hurdles as we talked about earlier. Azer-cel is combined with IL-2. This is designed to support the T cell expansion and persistence while maintaining a manageable safety profile. The latest clinical data are encouraging, showing meaningful response rates with promising early signs of durability. From the patient's and site perspective, an allogeneic therapy like Azer-cel simplifies the treatment pathway, reduces wait times. We are expanding the opportunity to intervene earlier, including CAR-T naive patients in niche indications. But perhaps most importantly, hearing firsthand about the patient's experiences highlights the real-world potential of this therapy, not just in expanding response, but in improving quality of life and access to care. We look forward to the next phase of development and continuing to bring this innovation to patients in need. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.